Chapter 1. Once Upon a World in Time. Deception, the art of making someone believe in untruth. It has 4 categories, one of which happens to be isolating lies involving knowledge of another person. A little boy is about to be given a masterclass on this dreadful night. The pretentious guardian stood beside him. One slimy hand placed upon the little boy's shoulder appeared to be a source of comfort. A deliberately lightened grip triggered compliance in the child's brain. The 2 individuals are barely noticeable in the shadows, fitting against the eerie monastery-like building. The Orphanarium gave an ominous atmosphere. The Gothic architecture was unwelcoming. Its design originated in Europe in the Middle Ages, with the classic pointed arches integral to its exterior. Grotesque stone figures protrude from the gutters. Their original function of spouting water overflow is now unnecessary. The monstrous gargoyles with exaggerated features were still intact. They looked down below, offering no protection but bearing testament to the unfolding misery. The interior had long been stripped of its original features. The one exception was an enormous stained glass window greeting you upon entry. The tragic scene remained motionless as the police car approached. The intensity of the blue rotating light encircled the pair. The boy remained stationary, mystifying though it must have been to a 6-year-old. The gravity of the situation was not lost on the policeman, and luckily, the dutiful officer was blessed with a calming manner. He managed to maintain eye contact by lowering himself to a level with the boy's height. "I have something very unfortunate to tell you. You see, your mummy and daddy have been in an accident, and they have both died. It is said that children of such a young age cannot understand the permanency of death. This could be true of young Dothraki. Nonetheless, no amount of sensitivity could save him from the following sentence, the implications of which he understood all too well. Orphaned at such a young age." And there it was, the punch in the gut. An orphan. Dothraki's conceptualization of the word orphan was not derived from the beauty of children's literature. Orphans such as Peter Pan, Oliver Twist, or Cossetti command respect and admiration. They are often children portrayed as free from familial obligations, usually on some epic adventure. Well, no orphan origin story came to mind on this dismal night. The disbelief for the newly orphaned boy caused a rush of adrenaline to course through his body. Both mind and body seemed to freeze. Then in quick succession came uncontrollable shaking. The policeman's gaze glimpsed a sight of a story yet untold. He'd always loathed this location, and to tell a little boy he is an orphan actually in front of the Orphanarium was mind-blowing. Retreating into the police car, he sought safety with his familiarity. He drove away, taking the strange blue lights with him, glad he had fulfilled his role. The evening was almost complete. The pair entered the orphanage behind them. Gazing upwards, the child saw a rusty sign overhead, like some cruel baby's mobile, creaking back and forth. The scriptures upon it read, John 14:18. "I shall not leave thee as orphans. I will come to you." Why, then, at this spot was young Dothraki's soul left abandoned? Dothraki entered the building and stood beneath the stained-glass window. From his perspective, it was enormous. The entrance hall was dimly lit, meaning the true magnitude of the beautiful colors within the window was lost. The boy could barely make out the scene on the glass, completely unaware that in the past, the Bible story the scene depicted was for people who could not read, just like him. It was apparent that Uncle Felix felt no sympathy for the boy. The relationship between uncle and nephew couldn't be further from the conventions of society. Dothraki knew one thing. His uncle was a liar. Felix looked down at his nephew, who had his mother's eyes, ice blue, with long dark eyelashes. He was in there somewhere, lost in his grief. The black curls framing his face fell softly like a Renaissance angel. Attempting to hide his fragile emotional state, he gently lifted his hand and wiped away falling tears. But the tears came in quick succession. He had never had to dry his tears before. He mouthed, "Mommy, Daddy," silently to comfort himself, knowing better than to reach out to his guardian. Being a leading and renowned psychiatrist, Uncle Felix knew all too well the stages of grief. He heaved a large sigh. "You'll be sleeping in the Robin's room this evening. Each dormitory has been named after British birds, including kestrels, herons, and starlings." Upon completing his sentence, Felix knew he might as well be speaking ancient Greek. The information was lost entirely on the now exhausted child. So his uncle gestured toward one of the beds, and the little boy walked toward it without guidance. The massive door into the dorm closed with a very gentle clink. Felix had disappeared without a kind word. Broken and alone, the child climbed onto the bed, wishing he had died too. He huddled up and compressed his body into a tiny ball. His legs were crossed underneath him, shoes were still on his feet, and his laces fastened. The decision to create the smallest body shape possible was a subconscious one. The clothes that he wore were chosen for him that morning by his mummy. The collar of his shirt was cold against his cheek, and now damp with tears. Eventually, exhausted, he found himself in deep slumber. He was far away, for now, from his frightening new reality. A reality in which he was alone. The twisted hand of fate had thrust him from his former life into a new, unforgiving reality in which there would be no family meals, no kind smiles, and no mom. The gradual awareness that he was having a flashback created confusion momentarily. The man's teeth clenched. He didn't get them much these days, thankfully. Mr. Dothraki tensed to suppress an involuntary shoulder shrug. Why does the body keep an account of adversity in childhood? Nobody would dare to put a hand on his shoulder these days. Anyways, it's time to minimize that particular window. He had work to do. Mr. Dothraki's attire spoke volumes. No sloppy t-shirt and bedhead attempting to look cool on work calls. His meticulous attention to detail was apparent in his elegant suit, which fitted perfectly. Mr. Dothraki joined the meeting preoccupied with a speck of blood on his jacket sleeve. He scratched it with his nail repeatedly, trying to remove it. Clearly agitated, he suddenly looked out at the various faces appearing on his screen. He looked on in disdain. Most of them accept their choice to be in Mr. Dothraki's employment, but secretly seek to fulfill new roles as far away from him as possible. They, in return, offered begrudging respect. Top left of Mr. Dothraki's screen was his lawyer, Henry. Henry was old school. He had a bald head, tufts of gray hair at the sides, and he chain-smoked the fattest cigars in the world. No one truly knows what he looks like because there is always a cloud obscuring his face. What can be seen in the nicotine stains on his fingers. More importantly, he had a talent for making money. Mr. Dothraki liked that, though he didn't particularly like Henry. With Mr. Dothraki's endless dirty deals, Henry had often protected him from the authorities' wrath. Henry might stink of Monte Cristos and Cohibas, but he was one hell of a lawyer. Top and center was Wendy, the PA. She was very well organized, but always up against it, as she had 3 small children in Mr. Dothraki's challenging schedule. On the call, Whitney could be seen disappearing from the view and appearing at regular intervals as she used her abilities to tend to her children's needs and cater to Mr. Dothraki. She never missed a meeting, and Mr. Dothraki could not function without her. Unfortunately, he hated children, and Wendy knew it. There were various audible sighs from him when he could hear children crying. Consequently, Mr. Dothraki and Wendy's working relationship remained strained but functional. If she weren't so good, she would be gone. But she was, so she stays. Far right on Mr. Dothraki's screen was Edward, a company director. He couldn't be more useless. His incompetency knew no bounds, but he was a shareholder, so he had a seat at the table. Mr. Dothraki made sure Edward got the crap jobs, including the thankless task of mentoring the trainees. That job was so far beneath Mr. Dothraki that he couldn't even bring himself to speak to Edward about it. Edward liked trainees on calls, as they made him look good by asking stupid, pointless questions. Rick was the trainee on this call and was very keen to impress. He was smartly dressed, in a far cheaper suit than was acceptable, and he always had a framed picture of the boss behind him on the wall, which was an ongoing source of laughter for the others on the call, but they were used to such futile gestures by trainees. Mr. Dothraki shook his head at such gestures. Rick was what could be described as a nice guy. Mr. Dothraki didn't like nice guys. He interpreted this as weak, and from his horrendous childhood, he knew weakness was not an option. Survival at any cost was his mantra, and that was how Mr. Dothraki conducted business. Finally, there was an accountant, Percy. Percy was a weasel, in weaselly features and a weaselly demeanor. He looked after the money and turned a blind eye when Mr. Dothraki asked him to, which included the siphoning off of money into various hidden accounts. The books were so cooked you could smell them from 4 blocks away. At least you could if you knew what Percy knew. Mr. Dothraki had incriminated Percy in various ways throughout the years, so if he went down, so did Percy, making the relationship mutually beneficial. As a collection of employees, they were a necessary evil for Mr. Dothraki. They rarely met in person, as business was mainly conducted online. Mr. Dothraki liked his employees to be pixelated and not in person. In person meant niceties like pull up a chair and have a coffee. Online was distant and a red button away from a digitally slammed door. He liked it that way. Also, he got an absolute joy from leaving everyone waiting in the online lobby for 20 minutes before he started the meeting. Why was this particular meeting critical? It was the sale of an old orphanage, outbuildings, and surrounding acres of deserted land. The news of the deal offered confirmation of his evil guardian's demise. The cruel old bastard had finally died. That sick savage who had plagued his life was no longer with us. A smirk crossed Mr. Dothraki's face. He breathed in deeply and exhaled slowly. Ordinarily, during deals was where his unsympathetic nature worked. However, this deal was triggering a significant degree of anxiety, perhaps stirred by the knowledge of his intentions for the place. Safe to say, for now, kept under lock and key. The call rumbled on and killed time with the insignificant business. Each person performed just enough when called upon. Everyone recognized his priority of the old orphanage, although his workforce wouldn't dare question his motives. Finally, confirmation in real time showed up on everyone's screens simultaneously. The orphanage was now officially his, the relief visible on all faces but one. Mr. Dothraki's face was unchanged. He was not akin to showing emotion as his work colleagues would. The host brought the meeting to an abrupt end. Thankfully, Mr. Dothraki had left the forum, so he could not witness Wendy's angry moment. The overwrought mom flipped her middle finger at a blank screen, mouthing a cuss word. For the rest of the day, her laptop remained switched off. There was one more appointment on Mr. Dothraki's calendar that day, and he would be closed off to the world of finance for the remainder of the afternoon. The appointment was for Rosa, who believed a flicker of light remained in his dark soul. He believed she was the one person on this earth that had walked between heaven and hell.